4 marks. Less than the price of a pig in the markets of Vengerberg, and enough to purchase a hunchback girl whose father had abandoned her to poverty and whose mother had turned abuse into routine. The transaction was recorded in the ledgers of Aretuza in the year 1186. One line among thousands, notable only for the girl who would emerge from that purchase 90 years later as one of the most powerful sorceresses on the continent, Yennefer of Vengerberg. Her name would be spoken at royal courts from Sintra to Redania, whispered in fear by those who knew what she was capable of, invoked in contracts that shaped the fates of kingdoms. But before she was a name that carried weight, before she was beautiful or powerful or feared, she was a damaged child sold for less than livestock. This was not unusual. The magical academies of the continent built their power on such transactions, reshaping broken girls into instruments of political influence while extracting costs that would not become fully apparent until decades or centuries later. Beauty traded for ugliness, power traded for fertility, centuries of life traded for isolation that stretched beyond what mortal experience could comprehend. There was a time before sorceresses walked the courts of kings. In those early centuries after the conjunction of the spheres, when humans first stumbled into a world already inhabited by elder races and ancient powers, magic was a wild thing. It erupted unpredictably in children born with a gift, manifesting as fires that started without spark, as voices that carried across impossible distances, as visions of events that had not yet occurred. These children were feared, they were worshipped, they were killed. The chaos that moved through them could not be controlled, and what cannot be controlled must be destroyed or appeased. The elves, who had mastered the manipulation of chaos across millennia of study, watched these fumbling attempts with something between pity and contempt. A few of them, moved by curiosity or compassion, began to teach. Human students proved capable learners when they survived long enough to learn the fundamentals of channeling power, of drawing from the wellsprings of chaos without being consumed, passed from elder race to younger in scattered mentorships that would eventually coalesce into something more structured. The first human magical academies emerged from this transfer of knowledge. They were modest institutions at first, collections of practitioners sharing techniques and protecting one another from the suspicions of communities that still remembered what uncontrolled magic could do. But as the centuries passed and magic proved its utility to those who sought power, the academies grew. They formalized. They developed hierarchies and curricula, and inevitably, they developed standards. The standard for sorceresses was beauty. Young women arrive at Aretuza's gates, bearing the weight of rejection. They come from households where their presence had become an embarrassment, from families who found them unsuitable for marriage, from circumstances that marked them as broken before they had ever truly begun. Unlike the temples of Melitele or the sacred groves of the Druids, which took in only those girls deemed too damaged for polite society, the magical academies accepted anyone who displayed the spark of power. Beauty did not matter. Station did not matter. Only the gift. What the academies offered in return was transmutation. If a child survived the first years of instruction, if her mind proved sharp enough and her will strong enough to channel the chaos that flowed through her veins, then magic would reshape her utterly. Spines that had curved since birth would straighten. Legs that had never matched in length would align. Scars that told stories of abuse or accident would fade like morning mist. Birthmarks, pox scars, hair lips, crooked jaws, everything that marked a girl as less than perfect would be smoothed away. The young sorceress would become attractive because the prestige of her profession demanded it. This was the first lesson of Aretuza, and it was taught without words. A sorceress must be beautiful, not because beauty served her interests, though it often did, but because the institution required it. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers had cultivated an image across centuries of careful manipulation, and that image depended upon its practitioners appearing powerful, ageless, and desirable. A hunchbacked mage advising a king might possess all the wisdom in the world, but she would never command the same authority as one whose appearance suggested control over the very forces of nature. And so the girls were remade. The process itself remains obscured by the secrecy that surrounds all magical education. Accounts differ on the methods employed. Some speak of rituals lasting days, during which the subject's body is broken down and rebuilt cell by cell through sustained magical infusion. Others describe a more surgical approach, with enchanters wielding power the way a sculptor wields a chisel, carving away imperfection to reveal an idealized form beneath. Still others whisper of darker methods, of pain that must be endured as the flesh reforms, of screams that echo through the stone corridors of academies built to contain such sounds. The truth likely varies from academy to academy, from rector to rector, from era to era. What does not vary is the result. Girls who entered Aretuza hunched and scarred emerged standing straight, their skin smooth, their features arranged according to standards of beauty that the Brotherhood had codified across generations. The transformation was total in appearance and utterly incomplete in essence. The flesh changed, the soul did not. The academies understood this, even if they rarely spoke of it openly. The psychological damage that made girls suitable candidates for magical training did not vanish simply because their bodies were reshaped. The abuse that had marked their childhoods continued to influence their behavior long after the physical evidence had been erased. Aretuza produced powerful sorceresses, but it did not produce healed ones. Some rectors attempted to address this limitation. They incorporated counseling into the curriculum, paired damaged students with mentors who might provide the emotional support their families had denied them, created environments where vulnerability could be expressed without punishment. These efforts met with limited success. The culture of magical education emphasized power and control, not emotional processing. Students learned quickly that showing weakness invited exploitation, that admitting pain gave rivals ammunition to use against them. The competitive atmosphere of the academies reinforced the very defenses that prevented healing. Girls who had learned to survive through coldness and manipulation found those skills rewarded in environments where advancement depended on outperforming peers. The transformation gave them new faces but did not require new ways of relating to the world. They carried their old patterns forward into their new bodies, hiding damage behind beauty but never actually addressing it. Consider the woman who would become Yennefer of Vengerberg. She was born in the year 1173 to a household fractured by cruelty. Her father despised her from the moment of her first breath, and the reason for his hatred was visible to anyone who looked upon her. The girl's spine curved sharply, forcing her shoulders into misalignment and bowing her body toward the earth. Her jaw sat crooked in her skull. She moved through the world at an angle, always slightly off-center, always bearing the physical evidence of what her father called her mother's failure. The abuse was constant. Her father struck her when his temper rose. He struck her mother when she tried to intervene. Eventually, he left them both for another woman, abandoning the household to poverty and shame. But his departure brought no peace. The mother, bitter and broken, turned her own grief into violence against the daughter she had once tried to protect. The girl who would become Yennefer learned early that the world offered no refuge for the damaged. She learned to make herself small, to anticipate the moods of those who held power over her, to read the subtle shifts in expression that preceded violence. She learned that her body was a source of shame, that her existence was a burden, that love was a thing other people received but she did not deserve. These lessons carved themselves into her understanding of the world more deeply than any physical scar. When Tissaia de Vries arrived in Vengerberg seeking potential apprentices, she found a child who had been so thoroughly taught to hate herself that she carried her ugliness like a brand. The rectoress of Aretuza purchased her for 4 marks, a sum deliberately chosen to be less than the price of a pig. It was not cruelty that motivated this insult, or not entirely. Tissaia understood that the girl needed to understand her own lack of worth in the eyes of the world before she could build something new from the wreckage. The transaction was clinical. Money changed hands. A child changed owners. The mother showed no grief at the parting. Perhaps she felt relief. Perhaps she had exhausted her capacity for feeling anything at all. Yennefer arrived at Aretuza carrying nothing but rage and despair. On her first night within the academy's walls, she took a shard of broken mirror and opened the veins in both wrists. The choice of instrument was significant, though perhaps she did not consciously understand its significance at the time. A mirror, the thing that showed her what she was, the thing that confirmed every cruel word her father had spoken, every disgusted look her mother had given. She used the instrument of her humiliation to attempt her escape from it. She survived. Tissaia saw to that. The rectoress found her bleeding on the cold stone floor and refused to let her die. Whether this was compassion or investment, or simply the unwillingness to lose a student before that student had proven her worth, Tissaia never explained. She healed the wounds with magic that left scars, raised lines of silver tissue that even the most powerful healing could not entirely erase. Yennefer would carry them for the rest of her very long life, hidden beneath velvet chokers and obsidian pendants, visible only to those who knew where to look. The transformation came later. Whether it occurred immediately after her suicide attempt, as some accounts suggest, or after years of training had proven her worthy of investment, the result was the same. The hunchback vanished, the crooked jaw aligned. The girl who had crawled through childhood bearing the weight of her own deformity emerged as a woman of striking presence. Raven-haired and violet-eyed, her shoulders level, her spine straight, her body a weapon as sharp as any blade. She learned to wield that weapon with precision. Her beauty became armor, a shield against the vulnerability she had known too intimately in her former life. She cultivated coldness because warmth had only ever invited pain. She projected confidence because she had learned what happened to those who showed weakness. The hunchback girl still existed within her, but Yennefer buried her so deep that even she sometimes forgot the child was there. But Geralt of Rivia, the Witcher whose destiny would intertwine with hers across decades of passion and pain, saw something others missed. When he first encountered Yennefer in the town of Rind, where she was hiding from local authorities who taxed magic users beyond reason, he noticed that her shoulders remained slightly uneven. The asymmetry was subtle, nearly invisible to anyone who was not trained to observe such details. But Geralt had spent his life reading bodies, searching for weaknesses, identifying the places where a creature's form revealed its nature. He noticed the way she held herself, the slight tension in her posture that suggested constant vigilance. He observed how her eyes tracked movement in a room, assessing threats before they materialized. These were not the habits of someone who had always been beautiful and powerful. These were the habits of someone who had learned to survive. And when he looked into Yennefer's violet eyes, he understood the truth. The magic had not erased her past. It had merely painted over it. Beneath the beauty that commanded rooms and kings and ancient powers, there remained the girl with the crooked back, still watching the world from eyes that had learned cruelty before they learned anything else. The result, as one account put it, was pseudo-pretty women with the angry and cold eyes of ugly girls. Girls who could never forget that their beauty had been bought at a price, covered by a mask of magic only for the prestige of their profession. This was what the transformation truly created. Not beautiful women, damaged women wearing beautiful masks. The cost of transformation extended far beyond the erasure of physical imperfection. Most women who underwent the reshaping of their bodies at Aretuza or Ban Ard emerged from the process sterile. The reasons varied depending on who was asked. Some claimed that the magical alterations disrupted the delicate balance of bodily humors necessary for conception. Others pointed to changes in the pituitary gland, the small organ at the base of the skull that governed growth and reproduction. Still others argued that fertility was simply incompatible with the sustained use of magical power, that channeling chaos through one's body inevitably burned away the capacity to create new life. The truth likely combined elements of all these explanations. Magic reshaped the body according to standards of beauty that prioritized appearance over function. The alterations that created smooth skin and symmetrical features and preserved youth also disrupted the subtle biological processes that enabled reproduction. The transformation gave sorceresses eternal beauty at the cost of eternal emptiness. Tissaia de Vries, the same woman who had purchased Yennefer for less than the price of livestock, wrote extensively on this subject. Her treatise, known as The Poison Source, argued that the loss of fertility was not merely an unfortunate side effect, but a necessary sacrifice. "No one is born a wizard," she wrote. "We still know too little about genetics and the mechanisms of heredity. We devote too little time and resources to this research. Sadly, we still conduct trials in the inheritance of magic ability using, let us say, natural methods. The results of these pseudo-experiments," she continued, "could be seen far too often in the gutters of cities and begging outside temple walls. Brain-dead and moronic women, covered in their own spittle, passing themselves off as prophetesses and seers, village diviners and miracle workers, cretins with brains degenerated by the uncontrolled power they inherited." Tissaia's position was uncompromising. Most mages lose the ability to procreate as a result of changes and disruptions to the functioning of their pituitary glands. Others, sorceresses most often, mature into their magic powers with their reproductive capabilities intact. They can conceive and give birth and have the audacity to consider that good fortune, a blessing. But no one should be born a wizard. Each of us must decide what she wants to be, the rectoress concluded. A sorceress or a mother. She demanded that all apprentices be sterilized without exception. The logic was cold but internally consistent. If magical ability could be inherited, and if that inheritance often produced damaged children incapable of controlling their power, then allowing sorceresses to reproduce was irresponsible. Better to end the possibility entirely than to risk creating more suffering in the world. Whether this policy was universally implemented across all magical academies remains unclear. Exceptions existed. Geralt's own mother, Vicenna, was a sorceress of considerable power, who nonetheless bore a child and gave him up to the witchers of Kaer Morhen. The circumstances of that pregnancy and birth remain obscured by time and secrecy. Perhaps she had not yet undergone the full transformation when she conceived. Perhaps she found ways to circumvent the sterility that affected her sisters in magic. Perhaps she simply represented one of the rare cases where fertility survived the reshaping of flesh. The woman who would become Ciri's great-great-grandmother carried the elder blood through generations of daughters, some of whom displayed magical abilities of their own. That bloodline persisted despite the Brotherhood's attempts to control magical reproduction, suggesting that the sterilization policy was never as universal as Tissaia demanded. But for most sorceresses, for the vast majority who passed through the halls of Aretuza and emerged to take positions at royal courts or magical institutions, fertility was a price paid alongside beauty. They traded the possibility of children for the certainty of power. They surrendered future generations for present influence. Many of them did not understand the magnitude of this sacrifice until years or decades later, when the absence of what they had lost began to ache in ways that power could not soothe. Yennefer of Vengerberg was among those who paid the price of sterility, and she was among those who came to regret it most deeply. For nearly a century, she would search for ways to reverse what had been done to her. She pursued rumors of magical procedures that could restore what the transformation had taken. She sought dragon components that alchemists claimed could regenerate damaged tissue. She consulted healers and herbalists and hedge witches, and anyone else who promised even the slightest hope. The search became an obsession. It drove her to take risks that more cautious sorceresses would have avoided. When she heard that a golden dragon had been spotted in the Kestrel Mountains, she joined a hunting party not for glory or wealth, but because dragon parts were rumored to possess regenerative properties beyond anything else in the natural world. She was willing to participate in the destruction of one of the rarest creatures on the continent, if it meant she might restore what magic had taken from her. Nothing worked. Mother Nanika, the sharp-tongued priestess of Melitele, who treated Geralt's wounds after his battle with the Striga of Vizima, examined Yennefer at the sorceress's request. The priestess had seen many ailments in her long service to the goddess, had healed wounds that should have been fatal, and cured diseases that defied conventional medicine. But when she examined Yennefer, her diagnosis was blunt. The damage to Yennefer's reproductive organs was irreversible. No prayer, no potion, no spell could repair what magic had unmade. The transformation that had given her beauty had also ensured she would never bear a child of her own body. Yennefer raged. She wept. She buried the grief so deep within herself that even she could not always find it. The coldness that had always been her armor hardened further, protecting her from a pain she could not afford to feel. And she continued living, year after year, decade after decade, her body unchanging while the emptiness inside her remained forever unfilled. The face in the mirror stayed young, while the wound in her heart festered. She had traded the possibility of motherhood for the power to shape the world, and she had come to understand that no amount of worldly influence could compensate for what she had surrendered. This was the hidden cost that Tissaia's treatise never acknowledged. The sterilization was presented as a practical necessity, a reasonable sacrifice for the greater good of preventing damaged children from being born into suffering. But the women who underwent it were not statistics or abstractions. They were people with desires and dreams that extended beyond the accumulation of magical power. They wanted families. They wanted to create something that would outlast their own existence. They wanted the ordinary satisfactions that mortal women took for granted. Magic could give them everything except the one thing many of them wanted most. The second cost of magical power revealed itself more slowly. Sorceresses do not age as mortals age. This was known across the continent, spoken of with envy by peasants watching their own bodies betray them, regarded with suspicion by clerics who saw unnatural preservation as evidence of unholy bargains. The women who commanded chaos lived for centuries while the world cycled through generations of ordinary death. The mechanism of this preservation remained poorly understood, even by those who benefited from it. Some attributed it to the constant flow of magical energy through the body, arguing that chaos itself sustained the flesh in ways that natural processes could not. Others pointed to the initial transformation, suggesting that the same magic which reshaped appearance also locked the body into a state of permanent youth. Still others believed that sorceresses simply learned to channel small amounts of power continuously, maintaining their appearance through ongoing magical expenditure rather than any single transformative event. The truth mattered less than the result. Sorceresses aged slowly, if at all. A woman who completed her training at Aretuza in her 20s could expect to maintain that appearance for centuries, watching kingdoms rise and fall while her own face remained unchanged in the mirror. Yennefer of Vengerberg was born in 1173. By the time she met Geralt of Rivia, she had already lived more than 90 years. Her appearance suggested a woman in her mid-20s, perhaps younger, her skin smooth, her eyes bright, her black hair unmarked by the silver that should have begun threading through it decades earlier. This was not immortality. Sorceresses could still die, and many did, from violence or accident, or the exhaustion of channeling too much power through mortal flesh. The Battle of Sodden Hill in 1263 claimed 14 of the 22 mages who stood against the Nilfgaard invasion, their names carved into a stone obelisk that still stands on that blood-soaked ground. The battle had been desperate. Nilfgaard forces vastly outnumbered the defenders, and the mages who gathered to oppose them knew they were likely facing death. They cast spells that drained their reserves completely. They pushed their bodies beyond the limits that training had established. They burned themselves out in defense of kingdoms that had often treated them with suspicion and fear. Coral, whose real name was Litanade, but who was known by the coral lipstick she always wore, died on that hill. She had been a vain woman by the standards of even sorceresses, obsessed with her appearance, competitive about her beauty in ways that some of her colleagues found tiresome. But when the moment came, she stood her ground. She cast spells until her strength failed, and then cast more, drawing on reserves she should not have had, fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. Yoel died beside her, and Vaniel, and Gorazd, and Axel, and a dozen others whose names are now remembered only on stone. They were not heroes by temperament. Most of them had spent their lives pursuing personal advantage, accumulating power, navigating the petty intrigues of court politics. But when Nilfgaard threatened to overwhelm the northern kingdoms, they chose to stand. The memorial obelisk that marks the site of the battle bears 14 names. It stands on ground that was soaked with blood, in a place where the chaos of concentrated magical combat left scars that took years to heal. Travelers who pass the site sometimes report feeling uneasy, sensing echoes of the violence that occurred there. The dead do not rest easily in places where such power was expended. Even Tissaia de Vries, the architect of Aretuza, would eventually succumb to the weight of her own creations. But those who survived, those who avoided battlefield and betrayal, and the countless other ways the world devises to end ambitious lives, could expect to witness centuries pass while their bodies remained locked in artificial youth. The magic required constant maintenance. One did not simply transform once and remain beautiful forever. The preservation of youth demanded ongoing expenditure of power, careful attention to the balance of forces that held aging at bay. Triss Merigold, the youngest member of the Council of Sorcerers before the Thanad coup, spoke frequently of the effort required to maintain her figure. The chestnut-haired sorceress devoted considerable time each day to rituals that reinforced her appearance, small magical adjustments that prevented the gradual erosion of the transformation's effects. She was conscious of her appearance in ways that older, more established sorceresses could sometimes afford to ignore. Yennefer spent considerable time each day on cosmetics and grooming rituals that augmented the magical preservation already at work. Her raven hair required attention to maintain its luster. Her violet eyes needed occasional enhancement to retain their striking intensity. The scent of lilac and gooseberries that followed her everywhere was not natural, but cultivated, a signature she had developed over decades to mark her presence in any room she entered. The sorceresses competed with one another in displays of beauty and youth, appearing at gatherings and banquets in gowns designed to reveal rather than conceal, their preserved bodies serving as evidence of their power and mastery. This was not mere vanity, though vanity certainly played its part. Every sorceress understood that her appearance was a tool, a weapon, a statement of capability that required no words. A woman who could halt the decay of her own flesh could surely halt the decay of a kingdom. The message was implicit in every preserved face, every smooth brow, every body that defied the passage of time. These women commanded forces that ordinary mortals could not comprehend. They deserved respect because they had earned it through mastery of powers that could reshape reality itself. Their beauty was not a gift of nature, but a demonstration of skill. Male sorcerers approached the preservation differently. Where women froze themselves in the bloom of youth, men typically chose to appear mature, settling into an idealized middle age that suggested wisdom and experience without the frailty of advanced years. Istred, the sorcerer who had loved Yennefer before Geralt entered her life, presented himself as a robust 40. Despite having lived far longer, his appearance suggested a man in the prime of his intellectual powers, old enough to have accumulated wisdom but young enough to act on it. The gray at his temples was deliberate, a touch of distinguished aging that enhanced rather than diminished his authority. Vilgefortz of Roggeveen, who would become one of the most dangerous men on the continent, cultivated an appearance of distinguished authority that commanded respect in any court. His face was handsome, but not excessively so, arranged to suggest competence and reliability, rather than the unsettling perfection that some sorcerers affected. He understood that men who appeared too beautiful were often mistrusted. Their attractiveness read as evidence of manipulation rather than mastery. The gender difference was telling. Men sought to appear powerful through the semblance of maturity. Women were expected to appear powerful through the preservation of desirability. The standards had been established by a brotherhood that included both men and women, but had been shaped by assumptions that treated female beauty as a resource to be deployed, rather than a choice to be made. This was the world the sorceresses inherited, and most of them played by its rules without complaint. They had already sacrificed too much to question the terms of the bargain now. The cost of centuries accumulated in ways that had nothing to do with the body. A sorceress who lived for 100 years witnessed the death of everyone she had known in her mortal life. Parents died, siblings died, friends from childhood grew old and faded, while she remained unchanged. The ordinary connections that bound humans to their communities, that gave meaning to the passage of time, dissolved one by one until the sorceress stood alone in a world that had moved beyond her. The first generation of loss was always the hardest. A young sorceress would return to her family after completing her training, beautiful now where she had been damaged before, powerful where she had been powerless. She would find her parents aged, her siblings grown, nieces and nephews she had never met running through halls that had once been her home. Time had continued for them while she had stepped outside its flow. If she visited again a decade later, her parents might be dead. Her siblings would be middle-aged, their own children approaching adulthood. She would look the same as she had on her first return, unchanged, while everyone she loved had moved inexorably toward their ends. By the time a sorceress reached her first century of life, she had usually buried everyone who had known her before her transformation. The family that had sold her to the academy was gone. The friends she'd made during her early years of training had scattered to courts across the continent, pursuing their own ambitions, building their own networks of power. She might see them at gatherings of the Brotherhood, but these reunions grew less frequent as the decades passed, and the demands of court, politics consumed more and more of everyone's attention. Some responded by retreating from mortal attachment entirely. They surrounded themselves with others who shared their condition, forming bonds only with fellow practitioners who could match their span. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers and its successor organization served as communities of the long-lived, places where centuries of experience could be shared without the awkwardness of explaining to mortal companions why one still looked 25, despite remembering the founding of Oxenfurt. These communities had their own hierarchies and politics, their own conflicts and alliances, but they provided something that the mortal world could not: companionship that would not die within a human lifetime. Sorceresses formed friendships with other sorceresses that lasted for centuries, sharing secrets and rivalries and the peculiar loneliness of watching the world change while they remained the same. Others sought connection anyway, knowing it would end in loss. Yennefer of Vengerberg chose the latter path. She pursued relationships with mortals and near mortals throughout her long life, loving Istred and then Geralt, caring for apprentices and protégés, building bonds she knew time would sever. Her hunger for a child of her own may have stemmed in part from this loneliness, this desperate desire to create something that might outlast the endless cycle of attachment and loss. But even Geralt, whose Witcher mutations slowed his aging to a pace that nearly matched her own, could not fully understand what it meant to live as she lived. He had been human once, born to a mortal mother, raised in a world where death came naturally. The mutations that made him a Witcher had extended his life, but had not erased his memory of mortality. Yennefer had spent her entire adult existence as something other than human. She had been transformed before she had the chance to understand what she was leaving behind. The mortal world was always slightly foreign to her, a place she visited but didn't truly inhabit. Her relationship with Geralt of Rivia represented a commitment to feeling, despite the certainty of eventual grief. She loved him knowing she would likely outlive him. She allowed herself to care, knowing that care would someday become mourning. Perhaps this was courage. Perhaps it was simply the inability to exist without connection, even when connection promised pain. The transformation had taken her fertility, but had not entirely extinguished her capacity for love. She clung to that capacity even when it hurt, even when it would have been easier to retreat into the cold isolation that protected so many of her sisters in magic. The Jinn's wish that bound their fates together may have complicated the calculation. Neither Geralt nor Yennefer could be entirely certain whether their love was genuine or merely the product of magical compulsion. The question haunted them both at various moments, usually when the relationship grew difficult and the temptation to blame external forces became strong. But love compelled by magic was still love. The feelings were real even if their origin was suspect. And in the end, neither of them could walk away permanently, regardless of how many times they tried. The loneliness of centuries bred a particular kind of politics. Sorceresses gathered power not merely for its own sake, but as insulation against the isolation of endless life. They positioned themselves as advisors to kings, knowing that kings would die, but kingdoms would remain. They cultivated influence across generations, building networks of debt and obligation that persisted regardless of which mortal currently sat upon a throne. A sorceress who served at a royal court for 50 years would see multiple successions, multiple shifts in policy, multiple generations of the same family reaching for crowns and scepters. She would remember the grandfather's follies when advising the grandson. She would recognize patterns in court intrigue that repeated across decades because human nature did not change as rapidly as human lifespan suggested. This accumulated experience made sorceresses invaluable to ambitious rulers. A young king facing his first succession crisis could benefit enormously from an advisor who had witnessed a dozen such crises and remembered how each had been resolved. The sorceress's knowledge of history was not abstract, but personal. She had been there. She had watched the events unfold. She could provide insights that no book or chronicle could match. But this value came with dangers that wise rulers recognized and foolish ones ignored. A sorceress who had served at court for generations had her own agenda, her own network of alliances and obligations, her own vision of how the kingdom should be governed. Her advice was never entirely disinterested. She shaped events to serve her purposes as much as those of her nominal employer. The relationship between sorceress and sovereign was always complicated by this imbalance of experience. A king might reign for 30 or 40 years before death claimed him. His sorceress advisor had likely been practicing politics for 200 years before he was born. She had outlived his great-great-grandfather. She would outlive him. He was, from her perspective, a temporary occupant of a position that would see many occupants across her lifetime. This perspective could breed arrogance. Some sorceresses came to view mortal rulers as children playing at governance, amusing in their ambitions but ultimately insignificant in the longer arc of history. They manipulated kings the way adults manipulate children, with a combination of indulgence and condescension that poorly concealed their true feelings. Other sorceresses maintained genuine respect for their mortal employers, recognizing that the briefness of human life gave it an intensity and urgency that their own extended existence lacked. A king who knew he had only decades to accomplish his goals might achieve more in that time than a sorceress who had centuries to pursue her own ambitions, but lacked the motivation that mortality provided. The wisest sorceresses understood that both perspectives contained truth. Mortal rulers were temporary, but their decisions shaped the world in ways that persisted long after their deaths. A foolish king could destroy in a generation what his predecessors had built across centuries. A wise king could establish foundations that would support prosperity for hundreds of years. The sorceress's role was to provide the long view, to help rulers understand the consequences of their choices across spans of time that they themselves would never live to see. This was the service she offered in exchange for position and influence. This was the bargain that kept sorceresses at the hearts of kingdoms, despite the suspicion and fear that their power often provoked. Philippa Eilhart of Redania exemplified the political approach that centuries of life could produce. She served as advisor to King Vizimir II, called the Just, maintaining her position at the Tredegor court through decades of political maneuvering. Her rise had been calculated from the beginning. Philippa understood that influence at a single court, however powerful, was insufficient protection against the uncertainties of political life. Kings died, dynasties fell. The sorceress who tied her fortunes too closely to a single ruler risked everything when that ruler's fortunes changed. So she built networks. She cultivated relationships with nobles across the northern kingdoms, with merchants who controlled the flow of gold, with clerics who shaped public opinion. She gathered information through means both magical and mundane, accumulating secrets that could be deployed as weapons when the political winds shifted. When Vizimir died, likely by her own arrangement according to sources that could not confirm their suspicions, she continued to exert influence through his successor, the young and volatile Radovid. Her power did not depend on any individual monarch. It depended on the institution of monarchy itself, on the constant need of rulers for a magical council, and the constant willingness of sorceresses to provide it. Philippa was also among those who understood that the existing structures of magical governance served male interests more than female. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, despite its name, included both men and women, but the chapter and council that directed policy remained dominated by men who viewed their female colleagues as useful, but ultimately subordinate. The Thanad coup of 1267 shattered those structures beyond repair. When northern loyalists led by Philippa attempted to arrest mages suspected of collaboration with Nilfgaard, the resulting chaos destroyed the Brotherhood entirely. Tissaia de Vries, attempting to remain neutral, removed the magical barriers protecting the island, allowing the conflict to escalate into open warfare. Scoia'tael commandos joined the fighting. Redanian soldiers clashed with Nilfgaardian sympathizers. Mages killed mages in the corridors and courtyards of the very institutions meant to govern their kind. When the smoke cleared, the chapter was gone. The council was gone. The careful hierarchy that had directed magical practice for centuries lay in ruins. From those ruins, Philippa would build something new. 6 weeks after the Thanad massacre, Philippa Eilhart convened a gathering at her castle of Montecalvo. The attendees represented the most powerful surviving sorceresses from both the northern kingdoms and the Nilfgaard Empire. The invitation had been extended carefully, each name chosen to balance competing interests and ensure that no single faction could dominate the discussions. Philippa understood that the new organization she intended to create would only succeed if its members believed they had genuine voice in its direction. Triss Merigold arrived still bearing the psychological scars of Sodden Hill, where she had been so grievously wounded that her name remained carved among the dead on the memorial obelisk. She was the youngest of the assembled sorceresses, still measured in decades rather than centuries, but her survival of that battle had earned her respect that age alone could not have provided. Keira Metz came from her position in Temeria, where she had navigated the kingdom's complex politics since before King Foltest's death. She was a pragmatist by nature, more interested in practical advantage than ideological purity, and her presence suggested that Philippa's invitation had appealed to self-interest as much as principle. Margarita Lo-Anti brought her experience as rector of Aretuza, her concern for her students driving her involvement as much as any political ambition. The academy had suffered during the Thanad violence, and she wanted assurances that whatever emerged from these discussions would protect the institution she had spent her life serving. Shiala de Tancarville, the scholarly hermit of Kovir, arrived in person, her reclusive nature abandoned for the sake of survival. Sabrina Glevissig came from Cadwyn, bringing the perspective of a kingdom that had suffered losses in the wars. Francesca Findabert, the elven queen of Dol Blathana, joined despite her complicity in the Thanad coup that had enabled Nilfgaard's plans. others attended by magical projection, their images flickering in the candlelit chamber as they participated from distant locations where physical presence would have meant discovery and death. And from Nilfgaard itself came Aesir var Anahid, whose presence marked the meeting as something unprecedented. Northern sorceresses and Nilfgaardian sorceresses had never gathered as equals before. The wars between their respective realms had killed friends and colleagues on both sides. Francescu and Aesir had actively aided the Empire during the coup, aligning themselves against the very women, now asking them to join in common cause. The invitation to Nilfgaardian sorceresses was not forgiveness. It was recognition that the magical community faced threats that transcended national borders. Kings might wage wars over territory and trade routes, but the persecution of magic users knew no such boundaries. What affected sorceresses in the north would eventually affect sorceresses in the south. Only by acting together could they hope to protect their collective interests. But Philippa understood something that transcended even this practical consideration. The Brotherhood was dead. The structures that had given sorceresses political legitimacy and collective protection lay shattered. Without organization, without unity, the surviving mages would be picked off one by kings who feared them, clerics who denounced them, and mobs who burned them. They could rebuild what had been lost, or they could watch everything they had gained across centuries of careful accumulation slip away into persecution and irrelevance. The women in that chamber chose to rebuild. They named their organization the Lodge of Sorceresses. It would be a sisterhood, Philippa declared, because men had proven themselves incompetent to govern magical affairs. The Thanad catastrophe stood as evidence enough of male failure. Vilgefortz, the most powerful sorcerer of his generation, had betrayed the Brotherhood for his own insane ambitions. The male members of the chapter and council had been unable to prevent the disaster despite all their supposed wisdom and experience. No men would be invited to join. No men would be consulted on policy. The lodge would operate in secret, its members maintaining their individual positions at courts and institutions while coordinating their efforts through private meetings and magical communication. The goal was simple in statement and impossibly complex in execution. The lodge would bring the war between Nilfgaard and the northern kingdoms to a close, while preserving magical influence over the fate of the world. To achieve this, they would need leverage. They would need power that transcended the ordinary channels of court politics and military force. They would need the elder blood. Ciri of Cintra represented everything the sorceresses lacked. The girl was barely into her teenage years when the lodge turned its attention toward her, but her bloodline carried power that dwarfed anything the assembled mages could claim. She was descended from Lara Doran, the elven sage whose union with a human mage had produced the original carriers of the elder blood. The genetic legacy of that ancient coupling had passed through generations, sometimes dormant, sometimes manifesting in children born with abilities that defied conventional magical understanding. Ciri's grandmother Pavetta had demonstrated the blood's power at her betrothal feast, levitating in a magical bubble while chaos swirled around her, nearly killing everyone in the banquet hall before Geralt and the druid Mousesack managed to calm her. The magic that erupted from her was not learned, but inherent, part of her being in ways that trained sorceresses could only envy. Ciri herself showed signs of even greater potential. Her trances and prophecies at Kaer Morhen had alarmed the witchers who were trying to train her. She screamed in her sleep, spoke words in languages she had never learned, described places she had never visited with perfect accuracy. The elder blood that flowed in her veins connected her to dimensions and possibilities that ordinary magic could not touch. Her uncontrolled teleportation during moments of extreme stress suggested access to powers that sorceresses spent decades trying to master. She had moved between locations without meaning to, vanishing from one place and appearing in another with no conscious understanding of how she had accomplished the transition. This ability, if it could be trained and directed, would make her one of the most valuable individuals on the continent. The Lodge saw in her a tool of unprecedented value. If Ciri could be controlled, if her power could be directed toward the Lodge's purposes, then the sorceresses would possess leverage that no kingdom could match. They could end wars or restart them at will. They could shape the succession of thrones by ensuring that Ciri's children, carrying the elder blood forward, married into the families that the Lodge wished to control. The plan treated Ciri as a resource rather than a person. This was consistent with how sorceresses had learned to view the world across their long lives. Individual humans mattered less than strategic objectives. The girl's preferences, her desires, her autonomy were secondary considerations at best. The Lodge discussed potential marriages for Ciri before they had even met her. They debated which royal house would provide the best breeding partner for the continuation of her bloodline. They calculated how many generations would be required before the elder blood expressed itself in forms useful to their purposes. The discussions were clinical, almost mechanical. Ciri was referred to as an asset, a resource, a strategic opportunity. The sorceresses who debated her fate had lived long enough to view individual lives as components in larger patterns. They had watched generations of mortals come and go. One girl, however powerful her bloodline, was simply another piece to be positioned on a board that spanned centuries. Some members of the Lodge expressed discomfort with this approach. Triss and Merigold, youngest of the assembled sorceresses, argued that Ciri deserved consideration as a person, rather than merely as a carrier of valuable genetic material. Her objections were noted and largely dismissed. The Lodge had not been founded to respect the autonomy of individuals. It had been founded to accumulate and deploy power in defense of sorceress interests. The plans that emerged from these discussions would have horrified Ciri had she known of them. The Lodge intended to arrange her marriage to a suitable partner, preferably a prince who could provide political advantage alongside genetic continuity. Her children would be monitored for signs of elder blood manifestation. Those who showed promise would be trained. Those who did not would be married off to extend the Lodge's influence into additional royal houses. Ciri's own desires were irrelevant to these calculations. She was a teenager, traumatized and hunted, possessed of powers she could barely control. What she wanted for her own life mattered less than what her bloodline could provide for the sorceresses who intended to control it. Yennefer disagreed. She had come to love Ciri as a daughter during the months they spent together at the Temple of Melitele, and later during their journey toward Thanedd. The girl was not a tool to be deployed. She was a child who needed protection, guidance, and the chance to become whoever she was meant to be, without the interference of women who saw her only as a means to their ends. This disagreement would eventually place Yennefer in opposition to the Lodge she had helped to found. She would choose Ciri over political advantage, motherhood over power, connection over the isolation that sorceress existence normally demanded. It was perhaps the most significant choice she ever made. The Lodge's internal politics remained contentious from the beginning. The Nilfgaardian members operated under constant threat from their own government, which viewed any independent organization of mages with suspicion. Discovery of their participation in the Lodge would mean imprisonment or execution. They attended meetings through magical projection rather than in person, always aware that their communications might be monitored, always careful to leave no trace of their involvement. Northern members faced their own challenges as the witch hunts began spreading across the kingdoms. The Temple of the Eternal Fire, always hostile to magic users, had gained influence in the aftermath of Thanedd. Clerics preached that the massacre proved the danger of allowing mages to operate freely. Secular rulers, seeing opportunity in anti-magical sentiment, began restricting the activities of sorceresses who had previously enjoyed considerable freedom. The Lodge had been founded to protect sorceresses from exactly this kind of persecution, but its methods of protection often involved the very manipulations that fueled public suspicion of magic users. Each intervention that served the Lodge's interests, each death arranged to remove an obstacle, each succession influenced to place a more compliant ruler on a throne, confirmed the fears of those who believed that sorceresses could not be trusted with power. Philippa Eilhart's ambitions proved particularly dangerous. Credible accounts suggest she arranged the assassination of King Vizimir of Redania, the same monarch she had served as advisor for decades. Later, she played roles in the deaths of two other monarchs, Demavend of Edern and Foltest of Temeria. Her willingness to murder kings demonstrated both the Lodge's reach and its vulnerability. Such actions, once discovered, would turn every throne on the continent against them. Philippa possessed a rare gift among sorceresses. She could polymorph, transforming her physical form into that of a large gray owl. This ability allowed her to escape situations that would have trapped lesser mages, to spy on enemies without detection, to vanish from danger with a flutter of wings. She used it to gather information, to attend meetings without being observed, to move through the world in ways that even magical surveillance could not track. The ability also reflected something about her character. She was a creature of shadows and secrets, more comfortable operating unseen than confronting opposition directly. Her power came from knowing things that others did not, from being present without being noticed, from striking before her targets realized they were threatened. She occasionally took lovers, including the Redanian spy master Dijkstra, but she never seemed to offer anything beyond the physical. The relationships were arrangements, not attachments. When Dijkstra began investigating Vizimir's death and grew too close to discovering her involvement, she didn't hesitate to have him removed from her presence. She blinded him with magic, eliminating his usefulness as a threat while demonstrating that her personal feelings, if she had any, would never interfere with her pursuit of power. Power was her only true companion. She would pursue it until her dying breath. The Lodge's eventual fate remains shrouded in conflicting accounts. Some records suggest the organization simply dissolved as its members were hunted down during the witch hunts. The persecution that had driven the Lodge's founding eventually succeeded in destroying it. Sorceresses were burned or drowned, or imprisoned across the northern kingdoms. Those who survived went into hiding, abandoning the political ambitions that had motivated the Lodge's creation in favor of simple survival. Others describe a gradual loss of cohesion as the sorceresses' competing interests pulled them in different directions. The unity that had seemed possible in the immediate aftermath of Thanedd proved impossible to maintain across years of conflicting priorities. Northern members and Nilfgaardian members found themselves on opposite sides of the continuing war. Younger members grew impatient with the caution of their elders. Personal rivalries that had been suppressed in the name of collective survival resurfaced as the immediate threat receded. Philippa herself was captured, tortured, and killed by the forces of Archpriest Willimer, her eyes gouged out before her execution. The polymorph ability that had served her so well for so long could not save her when she was finally cornered. The owl became a woman, and the woman died screaming. Years later, her name would be spoken with reverence by followers of the cult of the Great Mother Goddess. Saint Philippa, they called her, martyr of the Grand Lodge. The woman who had murdered kings and manipulated nations became, in death, a symbol of resistance against persecution. The complexity of her actual life was simplified into a narrative of noble suffering. The women who had traded beauty and fertility and mortal connection for power found themselves remembered, ultimately, as victims of the very world they had tried to control. The longevity that was supposed to give them advantages over mortal rivals became meaningless when that longevity was cut short by violence. The networks of influence they had built across centuries collapsed when the sorceresses who maintained them were killed or scattered. The price of longevity, it turned out, was not paid only in sterility and isolation. It was paid in the expectation that centuries of accumulated power would provide security, and in the devastating discovery that no amount of power could protect against a world that had decided sorceresses must be destroyed. The story of sorceresses on the continent is a story of transactions. Every transformation began with exchange. Ugliness traded for beauty, fertility traded for magical capacity, mortality traded for centuries of preserved youth, connection traded for isolation, individual identity traded for institutional prestige. The women who accepted these terms did so with varying degrees of awareness. Some, like Yennefer, were sold into the life before they could understand what was being taken from them. A child of 4 marks, purchased like livestock, reshaped according to standards she had no voice in establishing. Others, particularly those from privileged backgrounds who entered magical training by choice, made more informed calculations about what they were willing to surrender. But all of them, sooner or later, came to understand the truth that the world preferred not to acknowledge. The beauty that men admired was artificial, painted over scars that never truly healed. The transformation did not erase the past. It merely concealed it behind a mask of symmetry and youth. The damaged girls remained within the beautiful women, watching the world through eyes that remembered every cruelty, every rejection, every moment of being deemed unworthy of love. The power that kings courted came at the cost of the most fundamental human capacity, the ability to create new life and pass oneself into the future. A sorceress could shape the destiny of kingdoms, but could not shape the destiny of her own bloodline. She could advise rulers on the raising of their children, but could never raise children of her own. The emptiness that this absence created could not be filled by any amount of political influence or magical accomplishment. The immortality that peasants envied brought loneliness that stretched across centuries. Watching everyone and everything familiar die, while you remained unchanged. A sorceress outlived her family, her friends, her lovers, her rivals. She outlived the kingdom she had served and the causes she had championed. Time became not a river carrying her forward, but an ocean in which she floated, disconnected from the shore, watching distant figures grow small and disappear. The sorceresses who survived learned to wield their losses as weapons. They transformed grief into ambition, channeling the pain of what they had surrendered into relentless pursuit of what remained available. Isolation became independence, the freedom to act without the constraints that bound those who maintained mortal connections. The hollow spaces within them became reservoirs of determination, emptiness that demanded to be filled with something, anything, even if the only thing available was power. They built institutions and conspiracies and dynasties of influence that lasted longer than any mortal could have maintained. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers endured for centuries because sorceresses devoted centuries to its perpetuation. The lodge that replaced it, though shorter-lived, achieved impacts on the political landscape that mortal organizations could not have managed. The networks of debt and obligation that individual sorceresses cultivated spanned generations of mortal rulers, and still, after everything, they remained pseudo-pretty women with the angry and cold eyes of ugly girls. Girls who could never forget that everything they had become was bought, not earned, covered by the mask of magic only for the prestige of their profession. To understand what sorceresses traded for longevity, one must first understand what they gained. The magical academies of the continent did not merely transform ugly girls into beautiful women. They transformed powerless daughters of desperate families into architects of political reality. A sorceress who completed her education at Aretuza emerged not just with mastery over chaos, but with access to networks of influence that spanned kingdoms and centuries. The training itself took years, sometimes decades. Students learned not just the channeling of magical energy, but history, politics, languages, and the subtle arts of manipulation that would serve them in courts across the continent. They studied the weaknesses of rulers and the ambitions of nobles. They practiced reading expressions and detecting lies. They memorized the genealogies of royal houses and the feuds that divided great families. By the time a young sorceress completed her education, she was equipped to navigate political environments that would have destroyed less prepared individuals. She could advise kings without being intimidated by their power. She could manipulate nobles without being caught in their intrigues. She could survive the treacherous waters of court politics because she understood the currents beneath the surface. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, during its long reign over magical affairs, positioned its members at every significant court on the continent. Kings required advisors who understood the mysteries of the world, who could predict the movements of celestial bodies and interpret the signs of approaching disaster. They needed protection against the magical attacks of rival kingdoms. They needed the prestige that came from having a powerful mage at their side. Sorceresses filled these roles with particular effectiveness. Their preserved beauty served as a constant reminder of their power over nature itself. A woman who could halt the decay of her own flesh could presumably halt other forms of decay as well. Her appearance was a living demonstration of capability. Their sharp intellects, honed by decades or centuries of study and intrigue, allowed them to navigate political waters that drowned less capable operators. They had seen similar situations unfold before. They recognized the patterns. They knew which approaches had succeeded in the past and which had led to disaster. Their sterility, ironically, made them more valuable as advisors rather than less. A sorceress had no dynastic ambitions of her own, no children whose futures might compete with the interests of her royal employer. She could be trusted, or so kings believed, to provide advice that served the kingdom rather than her personal bloodline, or so the kings believed. The truth was more complex. Sorceresses built power for themselves and for their sisterhood with every piece of advice they offered. They cultivated relationships with heirs and secondary wives and court officials. They gathered secrets that could be wielded as weapons when the political wind shifted. They ensured that whoever sat on the throne, someone would always need a sorceress at their elbow. The transformation that stripped them of fertility also freed them from the constraints that bound other women. A sorceress answered to no husband. She owed loyalty to no family seeking advantageous marriages for her children. She could focus her entire being on the accumulation and deployment of power without the distractions that limited mortal women to the domestic sphere. This freedom came at a price. It always did, But for many sorceresses, the freedom was worth what they paid for it. They had been powerless once, damaged girls in a world that offered no place for them. Now they shaped the fates of kingdoms. The exchange, however painful, had transformed them from victims into agents. The younger sorceresses of the post-Thanet era occupied different positions on the spectrum of ambition and isolation. Triss Merigold, born around 1235, was barely into her 30s when the Brotherhood collapsed. She had not yet accumulated the decades of cynicism that armored older practitioners against emotional connection. Her relationship with Geralt of Rivia, initiated during a brief period when the Witcher and Yennefer were separated, revealed a capacity for genuine feeling that more experienced sorceresses might have suppressed. Sodden Hill had marked her. The 14th of the hill carried scars that went deeper than the burns that had nearly killed her. She understood how quickly everything could end, how fragile even magical preservation truly was. She came to Kaer Morhen at Geralt's request to examine Ciri, whose trances and visions alarmed the Witchers who had taken the girl in. What she found exceeded her capabilities. The power that moved through Ciri came from depths that Triss could not fathom, sources that required expertise she did not possess. She recommended that Geralt contact Yennefer. It was advice that demonstrated remarkable selflessness, given that Triss harbored feelings for the Witcher herself. She knew that reuniting Geralt with Yennefer would almost certainly end any possibility of claiming him for herself. She gave the advice anyway, because Ciri's welfare mattered more than her own desires. This capacity for genuine sacrifice distinguished Triss from many of her sisters in magic. She had not yet lived long enough to view human connections as expendable resources. She still believed that love and loyalty could transcend the calculations of political advantage. Whether she would maintain that belief across the centuries ahead remained uncertain. Time changed sorceresses. The transactions they made to gain power continued extracting payment long after the initial transformation was complete. Keira Metz represented another variation on the theme of magical life. Born into circumstances that remain poorly documented, she had completed her education at Aretuza and secured a position at the Temerian court before the wars with Nilfgaard reshaped the political landscape. She was known for her intelligence and her practicality, for her willingness to pursue advantage through whatever means presented themselves. She had served King Foltest as advisor and confidant, navigating the complex web of Temerian politics with skill that impressed even those who distrusted her motives. Her beauty was considerable even by sorceress standards. Golden hair, a figure she maintained with careful attention, features arranged to suggest both intelligence and approachability. She had cultivated an appearance that invited confidence, that made rulers feel comfortable sharing secrets they would never have revealed to someone who seemed threatening or distant. When the Thanet coup destroyed the Brotherhood, she retreated from high politics. The network she had built over decades collapsed as her patrons were killed or fled. The position at court that had seemed so secure vanished when the structures supporting it disappeared. She found herself, for the first time since her training ended, without institutional protection. The witch hunts that followed made her situation worse. Templars of the Eternal Fire spread across the northern kingdoms, preaching against magic users, encouraging mobs to identify and destroy any who practiced the forbidden arts. Kings who had once valued sorceress counsel now found it politically advantageous to distance themselves from magic entirely. The advisors who had shaped policy for generations became liabilities to be discarded. Keira eventually found herself hiding in the swamps of Velen, one of the most desolate and dangerous regions of the former Temerian kingdom. The contrast between her former status and her reduced circumstances illustrated the fragility of sorceress power. All the beauty and influence and accumulated decades of knowledge meant nothing when kings turned against magic. Keira had been a member of the Council of Sorcerers, one of the 5 who sat below the chapter in the Brotherhood's hierarchy. She had advised royalty and shaped policy. Her word had carried weight in discussions that affected the fates of kingdoms. Now she lived in a village, pretending to be an herbalist, hoping the witch hunters would not discover her true nature. She treated peasant ailments with potions that required only basic magical knowledge. She avoided drawing attention to herself in any way that might prompt questions about her background or capabilities. The preservation that kept her young also made her vulnerable. An ordinary woman of her apparent age could have blended into the rural population without comment, but Keira carried herself differently, spoke differently, expected services and courtesies that peasant herbalists did not receive. Her preserved beauty drew attention she could not afford. Village men noticed her. Village women resented the notice. The very appearance that had opened doors at court now marked her as unusual, in ways that invited dangerous curiosity. She survived by making herself useful to the local population in ways that did not require revealing her full capabilities. She cured minor ailments with potions that required only basic magical knowledge. She provided counsel that drew on decades of observation without revealing how many decades that actually represented. She pretended to be less than she was, hiding her power behind a mask of humility that chafed against everything her training had taught her to expect. When Geralt encountered her during his search for Ciri, she saw an opportunity to escape her reduced circumstances. She attempted to forge an alliance that might provide protection against the forces hunting her. The Witcher represented a different kind of power, one that the Eternal Fire could not easily suppress, one that might shield her from the persecution that had driven her into hiding. Keira's fate in the years that followed varied depending on which account one believed. Some said she died at the hands of witch hunters. Others claimed she escaped to Kaer Morhen, where the Witcher's fortress provided sanctuary from persecution. Still other accounts suggested darker endings, confrontations with Geralt himself when her schemes grew too dangerous for him to ignore. Either way, her story illustrated the precariousness of sorceress existence. The power they accumulated over centuries could evaporate in a single political shift. The beauty that opened doors could become a mark identifying them for destruction. The longevity that set them apart from mortals also made them targets for those who feared what they represented. The transformation promised so much: power, beauty, centuries of life in which to pursue whatever goals a sorceress chose, but it could not promise safety. It could not guarantee that the world would always welcome what sorceresses had to offer. And when the world turned hostile, all the magic in existence could not protect a woman hiding alone in a swamp, hoping that no one would notice she was different from the peasants around her. The most intimate cost of magical transformation was also the hardest to see. When Tissaia de Vries purchased Yennefer for 4 marks, she bought a girl who had already learned to despise herself. The abuse inflicted by Yennefer's father had carved hatred into her soul long before magic reshaped her body. The transformation that straightened her spine and aligned her jaw did nothing to straighten or align what lay within. Every sorceress carried similar damage. The magic that made them beautiful could not heal the wounds that had made them suitable candidates for magical training in the first place. The girls who arrived at Aretuza had already been marked as failures by the societies that produced them, deemed unsuitable for marriage, abandoned to institutions because their families could not bear to keep them. The transformation gave them power and beauty, but could not give them the love they had been denied. The result was women who wielded tremendous capability while carrying tremendous pain. Yennefer expressed this contradiction through coldness, through the icy precision she brought to every interaction. She had learned that warmth invited exploitation. She had discovered that vulnerability attracted abuse. The beautiful mask that magic had given her became armor, protecting the wounded girl beneath from further harm. But armor prevented connection as effectively as it prevented injury. Her relationship with Geralt cycled through periods of intense passion and bitter separation, because neither of them knew how to sustain intimacy without the fear that had become their default response to closeness. She pushed him away when he got too near. He fled when commitment seemed possible. They circled each other across decades, drawn together by something neither fully understood, driven apart by the defenses they had built to survive their respective transformations. Geralt had his own damage. The Witcher mutations had changed him in ways that paralleled the Sorceress transformation, stripping away some of his humanity in exchange for capabilities that set him apart from ordinary mortals. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else could, what it meant to wear a face that concealed a different truth. He had spent his life being called emotionless by people who could not see past the mutations to the man beneath. When he looked at Yennefer, he saw not the beautiful sorceress that everyone else saw, but the damaged girl she had been, and in some ways still was. This recognition created intimacy and terror in equal measure. She was seen. She was known. Someone understood her in ways that her careful defenses were supposed to prevent. The Jinn's wish that bound their fates together may have ensured they would always return to each other, but it could not guarantee happiness when they did. The wish created connection without creating the skills needed to maintain that connection. They loved each other and hurt each other, and separated and reunited in patterns that repeated across decades. The vanity of sorceresses served purposes both obvious and hidden. On the surface, their preoccupation with appearance reflected the standards of their profession. A sorceress was expected to be beautiful because beauty signified mastery over chaos. Her preserved youth demonstrated her power over the natural processes that aged and withered ordinary mortals. Her elaborate gowns and cosmetics announced her status to anyone with eyes to see. Beneath the surface, the vanity served as distraction. When Triss Merigold fretted over maintaining her figure, when Yennefer spent hours each day on her hair and cosmetics, when sorceresses competed with each other in displays of revealed flesh and preserved youth, they were engaging in activity that kept them from dwelling on what they had lost. The body could be perfected, the emptiness could not. Every sorceress understood this at some level. The attention they devoted to appearance was not merely professional requirement or personal indulgence. It was a form of coping, a way of focusing on the one aspect of their existence that they could control while ignoring the aspects that remained forever beyond their reach. They would never bear children. They would never grow old, surrounded by grandchildren. They would never know the ordinary satisfactions that mortal women took for granted. But they could be beautiful. They could be desired. They could command attention and admiration from anyone who looked upon them. It was a poor substitute for what they had sacrificed, but it was what they had. The competition among sorceresses for the most striking appearance, the most elaborate gown, the most preserved youth, was not mere rivalry. It was a collective ritual of distraction, a shared agreement to focus on the surface because the depths were too painful to contemplate. They admired each other's beauty because admiring beauty was easier than acknowledging loss. They criticized each other's failings of appearance because criticism was easier than compassion. Tissaia de Vries died believing she had failed. The woman who had shaped generations of sorceresses at Aretuza, who had written the definitive argument for mandatory sterilization, who had purchased Yennefer for 4 marks and saved her from suicide and transformed her into one of the most powerful mages on the continent, ended her life by her own hand after the Thanedd catastrophe. She slit her wrists in the manner she had once prevented Yennefer from accomplishing. The irony was not lost on those who knew both women. Tissaia had spent her career teaching young sorceresses to survive, to thrive, to accept the costs of their transformation, and build something meaningful from what remained. She had demanded perfection from her students because she understood the dangers of imperfection in a world that punished weakness ruthlessly. In the end, she could not follow her own teachings. The Thanedd coup destroyed everything she had built. The neutrality she had tried to maintain during the conflict proved impossible. She had believed that the Brotherhood could survive the political divisions that threatened it, that careful mediation could bridge the gap between those who supported the northern kingdoms and those who saw advantage in alliance with Nilfgaard. She was wrong. When she removed the magical barriers protecting the island, allowing the violence to escalate, she made herself complicit in the massacre that followed. The blood of colleagues and former students stained her hands. The institution she had devoted her life to preserving lay in ruins around her. She wrote a letter before she died. Its contents remain unknown, except to those who found her body. Perhaps she explained her reasons. Perhaps she apologized. Perhaps she simply could not find words adequate to the magnitude of her failure. She sat down at her writing table, arranged her quill one final time across the pages, and opened the arteries in both wrists. The sun setting through her window painted the room the color of blood. The magical academies continued to operate. Aretuza still rises from Thanedd Island, accepting young women with a predisposition for magic, training them in the channeling of chaos, transforming them into sorceresses who will serve at courts and institutions across the continent. Ban Ard continues to produce male sorcerers. Smaller schools and independent practitioners carry on the traditions that have persisted since the first human mages learned their craft from elven teachers after the conjunction of the spheres. The transformations continue. The trades continue. Girls arrive, broken by circumstances beyond their control, and emerge beautiful, powerful, sterile, and equipped to navigate a world that will fear and desire them in equal measure. Some of them will build empires of influence that span centuries. They will advise kings and manipulate nobles and shape the fates of nations. They will accumulate power beyond anything their damaged childhoods could have predicted. Some will die young in conflicts they could not avoid. The longevity that magic offers is not immortality. Violence and accident and the exhaustion of channeling too much power claim sorceresses as surely as age claims ordinary mortals. The memorial obelisks of the continent bear many names that should have lived for centuries longer. Some will find love despite the isolation of their condition. They will build connections that transcend the barriers their transformation was supposed to erect. They will discover that the capacity for feeling, for genuine attachment, persists despite everything designed to extinguish it. Some will spend their long lives surrounded by admirers who never truly know them. They will be desired for their beauty and their power and their influence, but they will never be seen for what they truly are. The masks they wear will become prisons, beautiful cages that prevent anyone from reaching the damaged girls within. All of them will carry the cold eyes of the ugly girls they once were. All of them will understand, eventually, what the transformation truly cost. Yennefer of Vengerberg would eventually find something she had not traded away. Ciri came into her life not as an investment or a pawn, but as a child who needed care. The girl was traumatized by war, hunted by emperors and mages alike, possessed of powers she could not control, and did not understand. Her grandmother was dead. Her kingdom was conquered. She had watched people die trying to protect her. Yennefer took her in, taught her, protected her with a ferocity that surprised even herself. The training was not always gentle. Yennefer knew the world that Ciri would have to navigate, knew the dangers that awaited a girl with elder blood and enemies on every side. She pushed Ciri hard because she understood what happened to those who were not prepared. She demanded excellence because mediocrity meant death, but beneath the demanding teacher was something softer. Yennefer cared for Ciri in ways that went beyond instruction. She worried when the girl was sick. She comforted when the girl was frightened. She defended when the girl was threatened. What she discovered was that motherhood was not solely a function of biology. She would never bear a child of her own body. That door had closed decades before she understood what she was losing. The transformation that had given her beauty and power had taken the possibility of creation. The sterility that Tissaia demanded as the price of magical education was absolute and irreversible. But she could still love. She could still protect. She could still pour everything she had into the well-being of someone who depended on her. The capacity for maternal feeling had not been removed with her fertility. It remained dormant, waiting for someone to awaken it. Ciri became her daughter in every way that mattered. Geralt, the witcher who had seen through her mask to the hunchback girl beneath, became something she had never allowed herself to believe she deserved. A partner, an equal, someone who knew what she truly was and loved her anyway. The bargain that had made her a sorceress had taken much, but it hadn't taken everything. But they returned to each other, again and again. Despite everything that tried to separate them, they found their way back. This was perhaps the greatest defiance of the transactions they had made. The costs they had paid were supposed to leave them isolated, incapable of genuine connection, tools of power rather than partners in love. Instead, they built something that the mechanisms of magical transformation had not anticipated. They built a family that chose itself into existence. Geralt was not Ciri's father by blood. Yennefer was not her mother by birth. The bonds that connected them were not the ordinary bonds of kinship, but something stranger and perhaps stronger. They had chosen each other. In a world where family was usually an accident of birth, they had deliberately created what others inherited without thought. The three of them had found each other through circumstances that seemed designed to keep them apart. Geralt had tried to reject his destiny, fleeing from Ciri multiple times before finally accepting the connection that the Law of Surprise had created. Yennefer had spent decades believing herself incapable of the kind of love that motherhood required. Ciri had lost everyone who should have protected her. Watching her grandmother die, her kingdom fall, her childhood end in blood and fire, they should have remained isolated. The forces that had shaped their lives, the Witcher mutations, the Sorceress transformation, the Elder blood, were all designed to set them apart from ordinary humanity. They were supposed to be tools, weapons, resources to be deployed, rather than people to be loved. Instead, they found each other. They built something that defied the expectations of everyone who sought to control them. This chosen family defied the expectations of sorceress existence. Yennefer was supposed to be alone, her sterility ensuring that she would never have heirs, her longevity ensuring that she would outlive any mortal connections she made. The transformation was designed to produce effective tools of magical power, not happy people. The coldness that armored sorceresses against the world was supposed to protect them from attachment. Yennefer found attachment anyway. She found it with a witcher who saw through her masks, who understood what it meant to be transformed into something other than human, who loved the damaged girl beneath the beautiful sorceress. She found it with a child who needed her protection, who gave her the opportunity to be the mother she had never believed she could become. She found it despite everything that should have prevented it, despite the abuse of her childhood and the trauma of her transformation, and the decades of cultivated coldness that she had believed were her true nature. The capacity for love had survived. Perhaps it was the one thing that magic could not extinguish. The story of sorceresses and longevity has no single ending. The pattern repeats across centuries, across generations, across the countless lives of women who enter Aretuza's gates, seeking escape from circumstances that have marked them as broken. The transformation offers them new bodies, new possibilities, new identities that seem to promise freedom from the damage of their pasts. And the transformation delivers on some of those promises while exacting costs that are not fully revealed until years or decades later. Women continue to arrive at Aretuza bearing the weight of rejection and abuse. They continue to undergo transformations that reshape their bodies while leaving their wounds intact. They continue to emerge beautiful and powerful and sterile, equipped to navigate centuries of political intrigue while carrying the cold eyes of the ugly girls they once were. The world that receives them has changed in some ways and remained the same in others. The persecution of the witch hunts eventually ebbed as kings recognized the value of magical counsel, and the temples of the eternal fire lost influence. Sorceresses returned to courts, resumed their roles as advisors and manipulators, rebuilt networks of influence that had been destroyed during the years of terror. But the memory of those hunts remained. Sorceresses who had lived through the persecution never forgot how quickly the world could turn against them. They built more carefully, hid their activities more thoroughly, maintained escape routes that earlier generations had neglected. The illusion that power provided security had been shattered. They knew now that no amount of influence could protect them if public opinion shifted decisively against magic. Some of them will find what Yennefer found. Some will build connections that transcend the isolation their condition creates. Some will discover that the capacity for love persists despite everything designed to extinguish it. They will form families of choice, relationships built not on blood or institutional obligation, but on genuine feeling that survives the barriers their transformations were supposed to erect. Others will become like Philippa, accumulating power until power is all they understand. They will manipulate and scheme and arrange deaths when necessary, viewing the lives around them as resources rather than persons. They will survive longer than almost anyone but will not truly live. Their centuries will be filled with accomplishment but empty of meaning. Their influence vast but their connections hollow. Most will fall somewhere between these extremes. They will love and lose and love again. They will exercise power for purposes both noble and selfish. They will struggle with the contradictions of their existence without ever fully resolving them. They will be neither monsters nor saints, but complicated people doing their best to navigate circumstances that offer no easy answers. And all of them, in their private moments, will look in mirrors and see not the beautiful masks they present to the world, but the damaged girls who made the bargain that transformed them. The world has forgotten what a sorceress truly costs. Peasants see the beautiful women at royal courts and envy their power and their agelessness. Kings rely on their counsel while distrusting their motives. Clerics denounce them as abominations while secretly fearing what they might do if provoked. No one asks what was traded to create the magnificent creatures who shaped the fate of kingdoms. No one remembers the ugly girls. No one thinks about the crooked spines and scarred faces and damaged bodies that arrived at Aretuza's gates bearing the weight of rejection. No one considers the pain of transformation, the loss of fertility, the centuries of isolation that follow the reshaping of flesh. The sorceress is a finished product, polished and perfected, and the world sees only the surface. The sorceresses themselves never forget. For those who seek more chronicles of the continent, its monsters, and those who hunt them, subscribe to witness further tales. Like what you've heard to support more deep dives into the lore that shaped this world. The stories are waiting.